Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu News Analysis. So let's begin today's discussion by first looking at the topics that we are going to discuss. I have chosen 4 important editorials and columns which are very relevant for the mains examination. Let's cover these articles in complete detail and then we shall take a look at the prelims related articles which are present in page number 11, 12, 13 and 18. So in total we have 8 articles lined up for today's discussion. So before we begin, why don't you support our initiatives by pressing the like button, share your comments below and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also as soon as the session ends, we have a quiz on our Telegram channel. So do subscribe to our Telegram channel as well so you can practice these topics by taking up the quiz. So let's begin with the first article from page number 8 of the Delhi edition. This article is focused upon the term Global South, which has been gaining a lot of prominence in geopolitics. So let's understand more about the origin and the significance of the term Global South. Let's also look beyond the article and understand why the Global South is relevant in India's foreign policy as well. This topic is extremely important for your mains, including for a potential essay topic. So first let's understand why is this term in news? What's the context? Recently there have been many articles in Western media criticizing certain countries from Africa, Latin America and Asia for not supporting the Western countries and the NATO with regard to the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. Many countries from South America and Africa and even from Asia, they are seen to be either neutral or indirectly aligning with Russia while not willing to support NATO countries and the Western countries. So this has led to a lot of criticism against these countries, which are often grouped together as the Global South. The term also has been in news because India has been prioritizing its ties with the Global South countries in the last few years. In fact, for many decades, India has been paying importance to the Global South countries. And recently we organized the Voice of the Global South Summit in January 2023. As part of India's G20 presidency, India has been hosting a number of meetings and summits, and India brought together all the Global South countries at the start of the year to discuss the common issues affecting the Global South countries. Recently, India has also proposed G20 membership to Africa, to the African Union, which is also seen as an initiative under the South-South cooperation that India pushes through its foreign policy. So as a result, the term Global South becomes very important for Indian foreign policy as well. As civil service aspirants, you'll be expected to know what does the term mean, what is its origin, what is its significance, and what role do Global South countries play in today's geopolitics, and what is India's engagement with them. So that is something we'll understand comprehensively over the next few minutes. Now the term Global South and the opposite of it, the Global North, they don't necessarily refer to geographical South and North. When I say North and South in terms of geopolitics, we are not referring to the geographical North or the geographical South. Instead, it refers to a group of countries which have a certain set of similar political, economic and socio-economic ideals and values. Countries which are part of the Global North are largely the developed, industrialized nations, especially the Western countries of North America and Europe, along with few other countries from Asia and Oceania region. Right? These are the countries which are developed, industrialized nations. They are often referred to as the Global North. Whereas the less developed countries, the developing, underdeveloped countries, the small island states, they are collectively referred to as the Global South. This is the essential difference between Global North and Global South. This is very clearly illustrated by this map which I have shared over here. It depicts the Brandt line that was drawn by Brandt, a very top thinker and sociologist and economist. In 1980s, he identified that the countries can be broadly divided between developed and developing countries through this line called the Brandt line. Even though it largely divides the northern and southern hemisphere, the term north and south here in geopolitics does not necessarily refer to geographical north and south. Global north refers to these North American countries, these European countries, which are more developed and industrialized. US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, right, and all the other European countries, along with few countries from Oceania and Asia, like Japan, South Korea, Australia and New Zealand. All these countries collectively, they form the global north. They represent the developed industrialized nations. Countries present below the Brandt line, countries which are part of Latin America, including the Caribbean and Mexico, African countries, the Gulf countries, all the other Asian countries, especially South Asian countries, even Southeast Asian countries, etc. They collectively represent the global south, which are the developing or underdeveloped countries. Now, if you look at the history here, if you look at the origin of the term itself, it traces back to the Cold War period and as well as to the post-colonial period. This is where the term originates from. In fact, there's a very interesting history behind it. See, today, most of these countries which are part of Global South, they have few common factors between them. Most of them are poor countries or they are still developing nations. They have very high levels of inequality, especially income and social inequality. They haven't been able to address most of the socio-economic challenges, including basic education, healthcare, standard of living, etc. These basic socio-economic issues have not been addressed in most of the Global South countries. That is something which is common to the Global South countries. Whereas the richer Global North countries on the other side, in North America and Europe, in Oceania and elsewhere, these countries have not just solved the basic socio-economic challenges, but they have also become developed industrialized nations with advanced standard of living. Now, what really binds the Global South countries is their common ideology and also the common challenges that they face. Historically, if you look at these countries, what bound them together was their shared colonial past, the exploitative colonial rule, how their wealth and resources were looted, their economy and culture were destroyed by the European colonial powers. That is what bound or brought the Global South countries together. From here on, the ideology built itself during the Cold War period. After the Second World War had come to an end, the global community was largely divided between the bipolar world, where you had Western countries led by US on one side, representing democracy and capitalism. On the other hand, we had the socialist communist countries led by the Soviet Union. So two superpowers, that is US and Soviet Union, they were leading their power blocks. And as a result, the world was largely divided between these ideologies. So in between this power struggle, a new ideology came up, which was the non-aligned movement that was championed by India and a few other countries. Few countries which had a similar vision, similar concerns about the rising Cold War. They had a similar colonial past. They had common issues and challenges as well. So they came together to champion a new ideology, a third neutral ideology called non-alignment. This would form the basis for some of these like-minded countries to come together, and India was one of the leaders of this movement. India with Indonesia, Egypt, and Ghana and others provided leadership to the non-aligned movement, and slowly the developing, underdeveloped countries, they started grouping together. These countries were primarily from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But the term itself, the term Global South, was first used in 1969 by political activist Carl Oglesby. He would write about the Vietnam War and how the Vietnam War, which included US invasion of Vietnam, marked the culmination of history of northern dominance over the Global South. In this book, Carl Oglesby was talking about the domination of the Western countries, the developed Global North countries or the Global South countries. That is where the first usage of the term was noted. Throughout the Cold War period, in fact, until the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the term Global South was not very popular. Instead, a similar word, a word which was similar to it, called the Third World, was more popular. Because during the Cold War period, that is between late 1940s to 1991, during this period, many experts, they would refer to various countries as per three divisions they had created. They would refer to the Western developed countries as the First World. They would refer to the socialist communist countries led by Soviet Union as the Second World. And all the other developing, underdeveloped countries were referred to as the Third World. In fact, this term, the Third World, which is a precursor to the term Global South, was first used by Alfred Sauvé in 1952 based on the divisions in the French society. If you look at the history of France, if you look at the French Revolution, the history predating it and succeeding it, there were three estates identified in French society. That was the nobility, the clergy, and the bourgeois. Nobility represented the rich, the elite. The clergy represented the religious leaders, and the bourgeois represented the working class. By drawing inspiration from this, Alfred Sauvé in 1952, he distinguished the global countries into three worlds, the First, Second, and Third World. According to him, the First World countries were the Western countries, democratic capitalist countries led by the West European and North American countries. Second World was led by the socialist communist countries led by Soviet Union. All the other former colonies, all the poor countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, they were grouped together under the so-called Third World countries. When this term was used, it actually did not have a negative connotation. Many of you might know this, that the word Third World today has a very negative connotation to it. It means very poor countries. It is often referred to banana republics, autocratic countries where there is extreme poverty, extreme human suffering. But initially when the word was coined and when it became popular, it did not have that negative connotation. It was simply a classification of different countries based on their political, economic, and social circumstances. But since the Third World countries largely included countries which were poor, countries which were suffering from instability, civil war, and they were being ruled by dictators, the word Third World became a very negative word which was further propagated by Western media. The Western media would spread stereotypes about poor countries, developing countries by calling them as Third World countries. That is where the negative connotation of the term comes in, somewhere around 1960s, 1970s. But prior to that, when sociologists, political experts, when they were categorizing countries, the word Third World inherently did not have a negative connotation to it. In fact, Peter Wasley, a very popular sociologist, he talks about the term and he popularized the term Third World, referring to the non-aligned countries led by India. Right? As India championed the non-aligned movement along with many other countries, the word Third World became quite popular. But later, through 70s and 80s, through the stereotypes promoted by Western countries, the term Third World became a very negative word with a negative connotation that often referred to poor countries, underdeveloped countries, countries suffering from instability or being ruled by dictators, and they were branded as banana republics. But these terms lost their significance with the collapse of Soviet Union. As the Cold War came to an end with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, it marked the end of the term Second World, and hence the term Third World also disappeared. By 1990s, these countries were now referred to with a new term called the Global South. It was in the 1990s that we saw the increasing popularity of the term Global South to refer to developing, underdeveloped countries. And this was seen as a more neutral sounding term that could collectively refer to these countries in Asia, Africa, and South America. And today, these countries are truly becoming a force to reckon with. Previously, they might have been poor countries. They might have been countries with instability, countries with severe socio-economic challenges. But today, the Global South is truly emerging as a leading power in geopolitics, and India is one of the leading Global South powers. That's why I insisted that the term North and South here in this context is not geographical in nature. It does not refer to geographical North and geographical South. Is that clear? The global South today is led by two of the largest economies in the world, that is India and China. Yes, both of them are located entirely in the northern hemisphere. Most of the global South countries, even though they are in the southern hemisphere, this is not a geographical reference. This reference has a history behind it, as we just discussed. The term global North and South is more of a geopolitical classification, not a geographical classification. Today, the term denotes a mix of political, geopolitical, and economic commonalities between these countries. There are many common issues that have bound the global South countries together. In the last 30 years especially, we have seen that global South countries, the developing, underdeveloped countries, they have certain common issues with the global North. Especially at multilateral groupings and multilateral platforms, these challenges come up, and hence global South countries come together collectively to oppose the global North in order to protect their interests. For example, at WTO negotiations, especially with regard to agriculture and trade related issues, the global North countries, the developed countries, have tried imposing themselves on the underdeveloped and developing countries. So at groupings like WTO, countries like India, even China and others, even Brazil, South Africa and others, they have given leadership to the smaller countries which are not able to protect their own interests. Collectively, they have opposed the dominance of the global North. We have seen the same with climate change negotiations. When the UNFCCC was established in 1990s, a clear divide came up between the developed countries and the developing underdeveloped countries. The developed countries were hesitating to take up historical responsibility for their historical emissions. They were expecting all the countries to take up equal responsibility when they were not even responsible for historical emissions. That is where India, China and many others under the G77 grouping gave leadership to South-South cooperation between the like-minded developing underdeveloped countries to ensure that climate change negotiations is built on the principle of historical emissions and historical responsibility. They championed a principle called CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, which meant that fighting climate change is a common responsibility of all the countries, but the responsibility need not be the same. The responsibility has to be differentiated based on historical emissions of each country, which meant the global North countries will have to take up more responsibility as compared to developing, underdeveloped countries of the global South. We have seen a similar coalition of global South countries at platforms like United Nations, World Bank and IMF in order to push these multilateral institutions towards their reforms, which are otherwise dominated by the Western countries. So this is where South-South cooperation becomes extremely important in today's geopolitics. These countries have collectively organized themselves. Countries like India, China, Brazil and many others, even Indonesia, they've given leadership to the grouping, and the economic rise of the global South countries is truly powering the rise of their influence in global geopolitics. In fact, according to several estimates, there is a clear shift in the global economic architecture which has happened in the last 20 to 30 years. The economic focal point was the North Atlantic region until 1990s, because all European countries, US, Canada, then even the Eurasian countries, they were the dominant economic geopolitical powers until 1990s. But post 1990s, we have seen the decline of the European powers. We have seen the decline of the North Atlantic region in general with regard to economic and geopolitical dominance. And we have seen a parallel rise of the Asia Pacific. In the last 30 years, Asian economies have risen to power, right? Economies like India, China and many others, they have risen to power along with dominating global geopolitics. So the global focal point of global economics and geopolitics has shifted from the North Atlantic towards the Asia Pacific region. So under the leadership of countries like India, China, Indonesia, etc., by 2030, we will see a situation where the top 4 economies, out of the top 4, 3 of them will be from the global South. Is that clear? only the United States will be the sole country from the global north in the top 4 economies by the end of this decade. India, China, Indonesia, which represent the global south, they would enter the top 4 bracket. Even if you look at the top groupings like BRICS and G7, and if you compare them, BRICS as a grouping in terms of GDP is a much larger grouping even as compared to the G7, which is predominantly a grouping of the global north countries. G7 is a grouping of developed industrialized nations, the Western economies. When you compare the G7 with the BRICS, that mainly comprises of global south countries like India, China, Brazil, South Africa and Russia, they tend to have a much larger GDP in terms of purchasing power parity. So this rising economic geopolitical significance of the global south is what brings the focus of the article. The focus of the article is on the rising economic political influence of the global south countries, how they are increasingly asserting themselves in global geopolitics because of their rising economic growth. Is that clear? That is the essence you need to take away from this article. To illustrate this argument, we have many recent examples that you can quote. For example, how China has led to the stability in West Asia by working out a detente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Recently, China has mediated and brokered a peace arrangement of sorts between the Shia and Sunni powers in West Asia, thereby stabilizing West Asian geopolitics. This has been done without any intervention from the Western powers in the global north. Brazil has similarly offered a peace plan to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Brazil has become a power broker in geopolitics today. India has taken many similar initiatives. As I mentioned earlier, we have recently organized the Global South Summit, Voice of the Global South Summit. We have proposed G20 membership to the African Union. This is a continuation of our support and leadership to the developing, underdeveloped world since 1950s, 1960s. This is something that India has not started recently. We've been doing this quite consistently since many decades. In 1950s, we supported the decolonization of the third world countries. We supported their freedom and independence movements against colonial powers. We championed the non-aligned movement in 1950s and 1960s. In 1990s, we gave leadership to climate change negotiations and acted as a collective voice for the small island countries and underdeveloped countries. So India has led from the front when it comes to South-South cooperation, and the rise of India, China, Indonesia and many other global South countries is a clear sign that global geopolitics is undergoing a change, a dramatic, permanent change as far as geopolitical equations are concerned. So this is going to influence the future of politics and economics as well. That is what the article is mainly focused upon. If you're able to draw this assessment with the supporting examples, and if you could understand the history behind it, that is more than sufficient to write a good answer for this. You can expect a mains question on the global south, the term, the origin of the term, the significance of it, and why India is paying more attention to the global south countries. So with this, I bring my discussion to an end with regard to the first article, and we move on to the next article, which is from page number 6. On page 6, we have an important column written by the representative of the UN Population Fund for India, in which the writer is talking about women's reproductive autonomy. How important reproductive autonomy is for women empowerment. That is the focus of the article. See, first of all, let me set the context. Today is the 11th of July, which is marked as World Population Day, which is an annual event celebrated since 1989 after it was designated by the UN Development Programme. Please write down this fact, very important for your prelims. In 1989, the UNDP designated the 11th of July as World Population Day. On this day, around the world, discussions, debates and conferences and seminars are held to discuss population-related issues, how to control population growth, how to promote family planning, how to promote greater awareness regarding sexual health and reproductive health, how to promote gender equality, how to tackle issues arising out of population growth. This includes maternal health, infant health, poverty. All these population related issues are dealt with on the occasion of World Population Day. It's in this context that the representative of UN Population Fund for India is writing this column in today's The Hindu. She is mainly focused upon the role of women in population control. So let's focus on what the writer is discussing, because the writer is bringing out some very, very important and interesting points. Generally, when it comes to population control, we are always obsessed with statistics like total fertility rate or TFR. TFR is nothing but the average number of children a woman is going to have in her lifetime. If the TFR is at 2.1, which is the ideal total fertility rate, you will achieve replacement level fertility. Essentially, if a woman is giving birth to 2 children on an average in her lifespan, a couple, a husband and wife, will replace themselves with 2 other children, which means at some point the population will stabilize. You will see a stabilization in population growth. So most countries like India, for example, for many decades they have tried to bring down their total fertility rate to replacement level fertility, which is around 2.1. Anything above this means population is going to grow quite exponentially, or anything below this, it means there will be a population decline. So when it comes to population control, when it comes to family planning, usually government's obsession, policymakers' obsession is with total fertility rate. They look at it as a statistic. They come out with various policies and schemes and initiatives to ensure that the total fertility rate is achieved so that we can achieve replacement level fertility. But in this, according to the writer, what we forget is the role of women. The critical role that women play in population control and in the entire reproductive cycle. Of course, it is women who give birth at the end of the day, and hence the writer is arguing that in any family planning scheme, in any population control program, women should be at the center of that initiative. That is when the scheme will succeed. Because generally what happens is that in patriarchal societies, in orthodox societies, women are often discriminated. When it comes to sexual health, reproductive health, women are not even given a choice regarding when they can get married, when they can have children, right? This is not just a phenomena in societies like India, it's a worldwide phenomena. Around the world, wherever patriarchy is prevalent, wherever you have orthodox, conservative, religious values being prevalent, you will see that women are pushed into early marriages. Child marriage also becomes a social evil in those countries, in those societies. Women have no control over their reproductive cycle. They're pushed into early pregnancies, right? So this discrimination, coercion, is what plays a direct role in increasing population, and it affects the health of the woman, right? Maternity health will be compromised, maternal mortality rate will increase. When women are forced to have children at a very young age, when their bodies are not ready, when they are physically, mentally not prepared, right? It exerts a severe toll on them that could increase maternal mortality rate. The infants, even their health could be compromised. There are many societies where women are forced to have multiple children in the interest of having a male progeny, a male child. This is again a feature of patriarchal societies where there is discrimination against the female child. So women are forced to have multiple children, children after children with very short gaps. And this also takes a toll on the woman's body and her health and her overall well-being. So that is why the writer is focusing upon better education, awareness, and more financial independence of women, because true women empowerment is what could solve this problem, this vicious cycle. Here the writer credits India. She praises the government of India for the efforts taken in the last 30 to 40 years. There are various progressive schemes which have worked quite effectively in India. For example, India has been pushing for all forms of contraception by promoting better sexual education, sexual awareness, reproductive education, with women as the focus, with the girl child as the focus. From condoms to permanent contraception, from male contraceptives to female contraceptives, even permanent methods like vasectomy, etc., including emergency contraception. All types of contraception is being actively promoted by the government of India through various family planning programs. We have managed to bring down our population growth through women empowerment and promoting gender equality, at least in some of the states, some of the fast growing developing states like Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, etc. This is a model we should ideally follow in the rest of the country as well. The writer even appreciates how India has brought down maternal mortality rate to just around 97 per 1 lakh live births from 254 in 2004. This is a very big achievement for India. We are on track to achieve our sustainable development targets as far as maternal mortality rate and infant mortality rate is concerned. In India, the MMR was 254 in 2004. That is, 254 women were losing their lives during pregnancy out of 1 lakh live births. We have brought down this number to just 97 per 1 lakh live births. We are on track to achieve the SDG target. This has been possible because of better healthcare, better education, better awareness, and women empowerment and gender equality which is being promoted. Because when women are given the choice regarding their marriage, regarding their pregnancy, their reproductive cycle, women tend to make better choices, which is good not just for the family and the society, but for the whole country itself. I'm sure many of you would have heard about the popular saying, you empower women in a family, right? Then you will automatically empower the society and the country itself. This statement is very true. There is empirical evidence to prove this. It shows that if you provide better education to a girl child, provide better health care, better nutrition, make her financially independent, you will see that women will make better choices. In patriarchal orthodox societies, they can push back against the male dominance, against family's dominance, and ensure they can get married at a age of their choosing. They can have children when they want, not because family is forcing them or husband or in-laws are forcing them, right? So that is the focus of the article, providing and protecting sexual and reproductive autonomy to women, which can directly contribute to improved population numbers and direct benefit with regard to socio-economic development. This in turn will solve many other problems, including poverty, education, healthcare, etc. So here there are some alarming details coming up as far as India is concerned in the latest National Family Health Survey. In the latest NFHS survey, the 5th edition of the survey which was conducted, it has been shown that only 10% of women in India are independently able to take decisions about their own health, which means 90% of the women, they are being forced by their family regarding their healthcare choices. This is even more severe when it comes to sexual and reproductive health. Right from adolescence, from menstruation to marriage to pregnancy and post-pregnancy, there is constant interference by the family which is influenced by orthodox, conservative, patriarchal values. When this is enforced on the girl child and the women, it tends to have a direct impact on their health and in turn on the society. It's a vicious cycle that we have created. Many women feel that domestic violence in a marriage is acceptable, which means it is acceptable for the husband to demand sex, to have forced sex even in a marriage. Women feel it is acceptable, it is tolerable. And that is an alarming statistic that has come out in the National Family Health Survey. It clearly points to the lack of awareness and education, the lack of autonomy that women have over their own body, the physical autonomy over their own body and their sexual and reproductive health. That is what the writer is talking about. So how do you solve this problem? First, focus on better education and awareness as far as the girl child is concerned. Provide sexual and reproductive health care and awareness and make this healthcare accessible and affordable. Next, increase labor force participation of women. Ensure that educated women and skilled women get enough jobs in the labor market. If you look at the labor force participation rate in India, the numbers are quite low. If you manage to increase this by 10 percentage points, this will not only contribute to increased GDP growth, it will also make our women more financially independent. And thus, it will give them more autonomy over their body, over their sexual and reproductive health as well. This is the long-term solution that the writer is talking about. So any government investment, any government initiative focused on family planning and population control should prioritize women empowerment and gender equality, according to the writer. She's calling for right investments in education and awareness, especially for the girl child, and better nutrition, better access to healthcare, and job opportunities, so that throughout the life cycle, a girl child or the woman can be protected, empowered. And this equality in terms of gender is what will give autonomy to women over their own body, over their own sexual reproductive health. And that in turn will contribute to social changes as well. Is that clear? So that is the underlying argument the writer is making. And according to me, it's a very, very important article, especially for social issues. So please go through this column again, make a note of the key points being raised by the author and the points I've discussed. You can expect a question or even an essay topic in your mains. Next, moving on, we have another article on page number 7, which deals with wastewater based surveillance for controlling epidemics and infectious diseases. It's a very small discussion, but still it's a very important point that the writer is making here. The writer is mainly talking about the spread of contagious diseases. He's focusing on infectious diseases that could potentially turn into epidemics and pandemics. So to prevent epidemics and pandemics, the focus in epidemiology is to ensure that we have better surveillance. There should be countrywide surveillance, global surveillance, to look out for the emergence of these dangerous pathogens, which could potentially turn into an epidemic or pandemic. So there are many ways through which such surveillance is established. One form of surveillance is through clinical testing of those who display the symptoms. This is a traditional classic method of keeping track of spread of infectious and contagious diseases, where the public healthcare institutions, that is the government hospitals, the testing centers, even private hospitals, they're all mandated by the government to immediately report the detection of any dangerous pathogen or infectious disease that is spreading in a certain community, in a certain region. So at a clinical level, with regard to testing, when people with symptoms report themselves and provide samples for testing, that is where we can pick out the potential spread of a pathogen which can cause an epidemic or a pandemic. Based on this understanding, based on this data gathered through surveillance, you can design measures through which you can contain the spread of the virus or the bacteria. But another important part of surveillance that the writer is talking about is wastewater surveillance. This has been another surveillance tool which has been used in India and around the world quite effectively in several cases. For example, when it comes to tackling polio in India, when it comes to tackling few deadly infectious diseases in Europe, testing of wastewater at random has helped in keeping track of spreading pathogens. Even during the latest pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, India and many countries, they carried out extensive surveillance of wastewater to track these pathogens, to understand the mutations, and accordingly design intervention measures for different regions and different communities. So the writer is stressing upon the importance of this. He is calling upon wastewater surveillance to be mainstreamed into epidemiology. India has effectively used wastewater surveillance while tackling polio. It did give us successful results, because wastewater samples coming from sewage, right, it contains the harmful pathogens and the strains and the genetic breakup of the viruses and bacteria. So regular testing of these samples at random across the country and updating this data in real time and sharing this data with others can help in better surveillance and monitoring of such dangerous pathogens that can turn into epidemics and pandemics. So that is what the writer is calling for. In fact, the Niti Aayog has focused upon this. In a recent report, the Niti Aayog has highlighted the importance of wastewater surveillance. It has identified the gaps in our epidemic surveillance and has suggested few measures to the government to improve real-time surveillance of deadly diseases that might spread in the country. So based on this, the writer is saying that India should implement a permanent model of wastewater surveillance in the country. Instead of testing wastewater samples at random in different parts of the country, it should be mainstreamed. It should become a regular feature like clinical testing. He's suggesting that in urban areas, sewage plants, in rural areas, wastewater ponds, from there water samples have to be regularly collected, and government testing labs should look out for genetic markers of dangerous viruses and bacteria and other pathogens and report the data in real time to all the concerned authorities. So it's not just about surveillance, it's also about sharing the data which is needed to keep track of such deadly diseases. The writer says it is possible for India to achieve this quite easily under the Ayushman Bharat digital mission. As India is digitizing healthcare, it would become much more easier for India to log all the data collected from wastewater surveillance from different corners of the country and make it available on a single platform for all the authorities, for central and state authorities, all the testing labs, etc. If they could all utilize the digital infrastructure being created and provide for real-time sharing of this information, it could help in tracking the spread of these dangerous diseases. This could potentially become a global framework as well, where all countries can implement such real-time surveillance platforms and share data in real time with other countries and global institutions like the World Health Organization. Such a global response is necessary to prevent another COVID-19 pandemic in the future. So that is what the writer is focusing upon. He is highlighting the importance of carrying out surveillance using wastewater samples. Is that clear? So I feel it's a very important point, a very important argument the writer is making here as far as health related issues are concerned. Now moving on to the next article from page number 10 related to internal security. In this article, it's been reported that the central government, the Ministry of Home Affairs, has instructed the state governments of Manipur and Mizoram to record biometric data of refugees and illegal migrants who have entered these two states from Myanmar. This is indeed a very important development because see, India shares a very long boundary with Myanmar. You can see that clearly in the map that I've shared over here. India shares a 1,643 kilometer border with states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur and Mizoram. Across this long India-Myanmar boundary, there are several border security, border management challenges. This border is highly porous because of its difficult geography and terrain. You have dense forests, mountainous areas, multiple rivers cutting across the border. So it becomes very challenging to secure this border. There has been constant movement of people on both the sides across this border. There has been cross-border movement. In fact, insurgents and criminals have often misused this boundary to freely move around between India and Myanmar. Several Northeast insurgent groups, several organized criminal cartels involved in drug trafficking, arms trafficking, they have easily moved across the border and smuggled weapons and drugs into India from the Golden Triangle region of Myanmar. Northeast insurgents from India have sneaked across the border to take shelter in Myanmar and they have found a safe haven across the border. So managing and securing this border has always been a challenge for India. And this challenge has become aggravated since 2021. Because in 2021, Myanmar went through a major political crisis. Myanmar's military, the military junta, has again captured power and established military rule in the country. Since then, Myanmar has been witnessing massive violence led by the pro-democracy protesters. the opposition leaders and parties and various ethnic groups, they are collectively fighting against the military rule, leading to large-scale violence in Myanmar. Myanmar's armed forces have used massive force to crush the pro-democracy movement, and this has led to a major human rights situation in Myanmar, and as a result, many Myanmar citizens have spilled over into India as refugees, especially those belonging to the Kuki-Chinzo ethnic group. This ethnic group is very closely linked with India, especially in Manipur and Mizoram. The Kuki-Chinzo ethnic group is a larger ethnic group of the region, and there are sub-ethnic groups in Myanmar such as the Lai, Tidim, Zomi, Lusoi, Hulongo. All these tribal groups, which are part of the Kuki-Chinzo community, they have crossed over into the Indian side as they are related to the Kukis and Mizos on the Indian side. In Manipur and Mizoram, they share familial connections. They are connected through familial ties. So these community members, these tribes from Myanmar, they have fled across into India, seeking shelter in Manipur and Mizoram, where they have families present on the other side of the border. Right? They have strong cultural ties and familial ties with them. So the state government of Manipur and Mizoram have sheltered refugees and illegal migrants in the last 2 years. According to data from the MHA, around 40,000 refugees are sheltered in Mizoram and 4,000 refugees have entered Manipur. But the government of India is not treating them as refugees. Because see, India is not a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. We haven't signed the 1967 additional protocol as well. So India has no obligation to take in these refugees. So the government of India is looking at them as illegal migrants who have entered India illegally, not as refugees who are trying to save their lives. But the state governments on their own have accepted them as refugees and even set up refugee camps to protect them. So the Home Ministry is against this decision of the state governments because state governments do not have the discretion to accept refugees. It's a foreign policy matter to be decided only by the government of India. The Ministry of External Affairs along with Home Ministry and the concerned departments like Bureau of Immigration, they will take the call whether we are accepting any refugees, whether we give legal status to illegal migrants from a country. This decision cannot be made by state governments. But state governments of Manipur and Mizoram, because of the familial connections with the other tribes, had accepted them as refugees, which was rejected by the government of India. The MHA is looking at them as illegal migrants and hence it wants a census to be done. It has directed the two state governments to collect their details, to collect their biometrics, including retinal scan, fingerprints and iris scans, so that we can clearly distinguish these illegal migrants from Indian citizens. Now this acquires even more significance in the backdrop of the latest ethnic clashes which have happened in Manipur. The latest clashes between the Methi community and the Kukis in Manipur is connected to the problem of illegal migration. Methis have alleged that Kukis are getting support from the Chin and the Zomi community, and these illegal migrants who have come in, according to Methis, are involved in producing drugs and smuggling drugs and in creating security challenges for Manipur. But Kukis have dismissed these claims. Kukis have said that we have just sheltered this community because they have come as refugees. And the state government also had supported these communities in accepting them as refugees. So the ethnic clashes that we have recently witnessed in Manipur, which is still ongoing, is indeed connected to the cross-border problem, the problem of flow of refugees and illegal migrants from Myanmar. So hence, to get clarity on the number of refugees present, the central government has instructed the state governments of Manipur and Mizoram to take a census-like exercise to ensure that their biometrics and details are captured so we know how many illegal migrants have entered the country. Is that clear? So that is the important development reported in this article. With this, we come to the last part of today's discussion. We'll take a look at few prelims related articles. On page number 11, we have an article referring to China's stand on the Tibetan issue and the problem it creates in the relations between India and China and US. As you know, China annexed Tibet in 1950. It occupied Tibet in 1950 and it crushed the uprising in Tibet in 1959. When Tibetan Buddhists, under the leadership of Dalai Lama, they rebelled. They tried to fight for Tibet's liberation and independence. Excuse me. So 1959, when the uprising happened, China crushed the uprising, pushing the Tibetan refugees across the Himalayas into India. The then Indian government, headed by Prime Minister Nehru, decided to accept the Tibetan refugees, including the Dalai Lama. This was both a humanitarian decision by India on humanitarian grounds to protect the Tibetan refugees, and also a strategic decision to gain leverage over the Tibetan issue, through which we could gain some leverage over China, as the border dispute had already emerged between India and China. So as India took in the Tibetan refugees and settled them and gave a seat for Dalai Lama as well, China was very angry, very upset about this. Because in the eyes of China, the Tibetan refugees who are settled in India, they are anti-national elements. See, India has settled the Tibetan refugees at Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh. This also serves as the seat of Dalai Lama, the religious figurehead of Tibetan Buddhists. And this is where India has allowed a parallel Tibetan government to function. There is a Tibetan government in exile, which is formally known as the Central Tibetan Administration, or CTA, which is headquartered at Dharamshala. So Dharamshala is not just a Tibetan refugee camp, but it's the seat of Dalai Lama, and India has also allowed the Tibetan Buddhist activists to set up a parallel government at Dharamshala called CTA, the Central Tibetan Administration. And this has always angered China. The other place where India has settled Tibetan refugees is Kushalnagar in Karnataka. Near Madikeri in Coorg, at a place called Kushalnagar, there is another Tibetan refugee camp where India has settled Tibetan refugees. So India has often allowed the Tibetan refugees to engage in their political activities. Especially 20-30 years before, India would openly encourage the liberation movement activities of the Tibetan government. We would allow Tibetan leaders and Dalai Lama to meet with foreign leaders and visit foreign countries as well. We would issue them passports and enable them to meet with foreign dignitaries to raise the Tibetan issue and the violation of human rights in Tibet. Whenever this happens, China has always retaliated against India by criticizing India for hosting these anti-national elements. Now this issue is back in news because yesterday, top US diplomats from the US State Department, they have met with Tibetan officials, including the Dalai Lama. They met with leaders of the Central Tibetan Administration in India, and they have interacted with the Dalai Lama, and India allowed this meeting to take place. The US Undersecretary from the State Department is on an important visit to India, along with many top diplomats of the US. This delegation from the US has been allowed to meet with the Tibetan government in exile and with the Dalai Lama. And China has been heavily critical of this development. It has criticized US for interfering in Tibet's politics because China looks at Tibet as its internal issue. It has criticized India as well for hosting the Tibetan refugees. In fact, please note down this point, China refers to Tibet as Xinjiang. That is the Chinese name, the official name given by the Chinese state, the Chinese government. This is something you should be aware of. The China resists any kind of recognition to Tibetan leaders, including the Dalai Lama. It has always opposed the parallel government which operates from Dharamshala in India, which the Indian government has sheltered. So this is a point of contention in the India-China relations as well. Now moving on, we have an important article related to economy from page 12. It refers to the usage of fertilizers in India. The concerned minister, the Union Minister for Chemicals and Fertilizers, Mansukh Mandavia, has said that import of urea will be eased by 2025 and alternate forms to replace urea will be promoted. See, if you look at the usage of fertilizers in India, the usage of urea has been exploitative in India. There has been an over-reliance on the usage of urea to increase agricultural productivity. While this helped India in the initial years, especially during the Green Revolution of 1960s, 1970s, you see that fertilizer application directly increased our crop productivity. But over the decades, you see that even though fertilizer usage has increased, productivity has gone down. This is because the soil is saturated, especially with nitrogen. The ideal fertilizer composition, the NPK composition, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium composition, should be in the ratio of 4:2:1. For 4 units of nitrogen, you should have 2 units of phosphorus and 1 unit of potassium. That is the ideal fertilizer composition to protect the health of the soil. But due to over usage of fertilizers, especially urea in the country, which was cheaply available because of fertilizer subsidies, the composition has changed to 8:3:1, which means there is an excessive concentration of nitrogen in the soil. And this nitrogen is not readily available to the plants, and it is changing the fertility of the soil, thereby degrading the soil's fertility and bringing down agricultural productivity. Studies have shown that even with increased usage of fertilizer, productivity is going down in critical states like Punjab. In Punjab, despite a 10% increase in fertilizers, 16% decrease in productivity has been noted. That's because due to over usage of fertilizers, we have harmed the soil profile. The soil health has been compromised. That is why the government is trying to promote alternative forms to urea. It has promoted the coating of neem oil to urea. It has promoted nano urea, which was recently developed by the Indian Farmers Fertilizer Cooperative in 2021. Right? Nano urea is a liquefied form that contains nanoparticles of urea. And IFCO, which has developed nano urea, has claimed that just around 500 ml of nano urea is enough to replace one bag of 45 kilograms of urea. That will reduce our urea consumption and reduce urea imports as well. Since India is deficient in the raw materials that are needed for producing these fertilizers, we import most of the urea and even the potash. So one of the long-term goals for India is to bring down these imports, not just to protect soil fertility, but also to help the farmers, to reduce the transportation cost, to reduce the back-end costs involved in agriculture, and also to bring down India's import bills. That's why the minister has said India has charted a course to bring down import of urea by 2025, replace it with alternate forms. See, we can't switch overnight to natural farming or organic farming. Because of the hazards associated with such fertilizers, we can't simply make an overnight switch. We are not Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka did a horrible mistake a few years back where it adopted organic natural farming overnight, thus destroying its agriculture. If today Sri Lanka's economy has collapsed, one of the reasons was this irrational policy of the then Rajapaksa government to halt urea and fertilizer imports and switch the farming in the country overnight to natural organic farming. Such policies are not advisable for India. It will lead to a similar collapse of the agriculture. So India is planning a phased reduction of its dependency on urea-based fertilizers. And in the coming years, you will see a reduction in the import of urea and alternate forms will be replaced so that soil fertility can also be protected. That is what we take away from this important article. Next, moving on page 13, we have an article related to international relations. A very important development. China and Solomon Islands have signed fresh agreements related to police cooperation, economic cooperation, and technological cooperation. Now, this is very, very important, very significant, because China has been making a lot of inroads into the South Pacific in the last few years. In the South Pacific, you have these Pacific Island countries. That includes countries like Solomon Islands, present over here, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Micronesia, Nauru, Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Samoa, Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Cook Islands, Niue, and many others. All these small island nations collectively make up the Pacific Island countries, which are part of the South Pacific. Traditionally, over here, it was United States, Australia, and Japan, which were the dominant economic and military powers. In fact, Solomon Islands is hardly 2000 kilometers away from the northeast coast of Australia. Alright? US even has a major military base in the region. It owns an island called Guam, where US has a major military base. So it's traditionally the Western powers led by US, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, which have dominated this region. But in the last few years, China has really expanded its presence and influence. It has interacted with all the countries and pushed the Belt and Road Initiative. It has promised massive investments to all these countries, and last year, it even signed a security agreement with the Solomon Islands, which was seen as an alarming development by the Western countries. China and the Solomon Islands signed this security agreement, which could allow Chinese forces, the Chinese Navy especially, to deploy its naval ships and submarines in the region and even build military facilities in the region, including potential air bases and naval bases that could further project China's military power. So this marks the rising presence and influence of China in the South Pacific, and now China is taking this one step ahead by signing few more agreements with Solomon Islands. With regard to police cooperation, economic cooperation and technological cooperation, new agreements have been signed. In fact, many of these countries have now started recognizing China as well. Until recently, many of them, as they were aligned with Australia and US, they wouldn't recognize China, they would recognize Taiwan. Even Solomon Islands until 2019 was recognizing the government in Taiwan as the legitimate Chinese government. But in 2019, Solomon Islands changed the policy. It started recognizing the Communist Party of China that rules over Beijing as a legitimate Chinese authority. Many countries have made the switch, and in fact, China has reached out to all these countries and it's trying to enter into such agreements, which includes security agreements, economic partnership agreements, etc. So this raises concern for US, Australia and other Western countries as it marks the rising influence of China in the South Pacific. Now coming to the last article, there's an important point that I would like to bring out. On page number 18, in the last page, we have a science edition at the last, where there is focus on quantum computing, and the article is focused on a particular term called Majorana zero modes. I just want you to understand the basics of quantum computing and this term called Majorana zero modes, as it could be important for prelims. As you know, quantum computing is seen as an emerging critical technology. It presents numerous advantages compared to classical traditional computing. In your traditional computers, your classical computers, the storage bits, right? They can only store either 0 or 1. The storage capacity is very limited in your classical computers. But quantum computing operates on a very different scale and at a very different level. If you understand quantum mechanics, right? This is basically subatomic physics. At the subatomic level, the way in which particles behave, they basically defy the traditional laws of physics that we have understood. At the subatomic level, you have these storage bits called qubits, which is the building block of a quantum computer, which can be both 0 and 1 at the same time. In your classical computer, a bit can either be 0 or 1 at a given point of time, which limits its computational abilities. But at the quantum level, a qubit can be both 0 and 1 at the same time, thereby exponentially increasing its computing abilities. Just to simplify this, I'll give you a very important analogy brought out by Schrödinger. To simplify quantum mechanics and understanding of the quantum world, Schrödinger came out with this analogy. He said, consider an experiment where there is a box, an opaque box, and you keep a cat inside the box along with a vial of poison. Now when the box is covered, for an outside observer, you don't know whether the cat is alive or not, right? So Schrödinger suggested that you can assume that the cat is both dead and alive at the same time, unless and until you lift the box and see what has actually happened. If the cat has broken the poison vial, it would have died, If it hasn't, it would still be alive. But for an observer from the outside, you don't know that state unless you lift the box. So this is the analogy Schrödinger used to simplify quantum superposition, which is a core mechanism in quantum mechanics, that a bit can exist both as 0 and 1 at the same time. So this is what transforms computing at this scale, at the quantum scale. Now here there are some complicated theories which you need not get into. It's not necessary from a UPSC examination point of view. But you should understand this term called Majorana zero modes. What is this? Why is it in news? It's in news because Microsoft has announced that it has figured out a way to create this unique and strange particle that could revolutionize quantum computing. Microsoft has claimed to have developed this particle called Majorana zero mode. This quantum material which has been developed by Microsoft, it could transform the world of quantum computing. So let's understand what is this material. In 1928, British physicist Paul Dirac, he wanted to better understand the quantum world, and he came out with the application of special theory of relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity, to the quantum world. So the equation he brought out is called the Dirac equation. According to Dirac equation, it was deduced that subatomic particles, they all have an antiparticle. For every particle at the subatomic level, there is an antiparticle which cancels out each other. In fact, they annihilate each other. So according to Dirac, he noticed that there are few particles which act as their own antiparticle. This was further confirmed in 1937 by Italian physicist Ettore Majorana. Majorana found few quantum particles called fermions, and some of these fermions, they are their own antiparticle. They are in a superimposition state. Is that clear? Where they are in two states at the same time, where the fermion is both a particle and antiparticle to itself. So for the fraction of a second it exists, it annihilates each other. Such a unique material, which is both its particle and antiparticle, is called a Majorana fermion. It was discovered by Ettore Majorana based on the work of Paul Dirac. By using the Dirac equation of Paul Dirac, Ettore Majorana further conducted these studies with regard to fermions, which are subatomic particles, and he found out that there are few fermions which are not just particles, they are antiparticles to themselves. And if you are able to create this material and make it stable, it could help in creating topological quantum computing. Because quantum computers are highly unstable. It's very, very difficult to preserve the state of the qubits. That is what scientists are currently struggling with. So Microsoft has reported that it has found out a way to create Majorana fermions in a stable manner, and if this is a sustainable and established technology, it could transform and revolutionize the world of quantum computing. So just understand the basics here, don't get into the specifics. It's not needed from a UPSC perspective. Just understand what is quantum computing, what are Majorana fermions, right? That basic understanding is more than sufficient. So this completes my discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper. I've tried to keep it as comprehensive as possible so that you don't have to go back and struggle in reading the newspaper again. I hope you guys have really understood all the articles. If you guys have liked it, why don't you support us by pressing the like button, share more comments, share the video with other aspirants, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Also take up the questions for your mains answer writing practice. Write the answers and post them in the answer writing portal, for which link has been given in the description box below. So now head to the Telegram channel so you can take a quiz on some of these topics and you can revise these articles again. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. Have a good day.